Thousands of Egyptians are taking to the streets, demonstrating against the overthrow by the military of a freely elected Islamic government led by Mohammed Morsi. Just a few years earlier, President Hosni Mubarak was forced out of power by his people. Before examining the political situation today, we will first look at what led to the downfall of President Hosni Mubarak.
Ron Levy. I'm at the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. It's interesting. The question of what led to the Arab Spring, one has to understand this as a variety of things that happen, including the need for human rights, including language of human rights, including increased expectations, but also including unemployment, underemployment, rising food prices, economic stagnation, and a very difficult educational system all at the same time, all of which happening within autocratic regimes.
Eric Margolis, political foreign affairs columnist, broadcaster, and a military analyst.
Egyptians at the best of times lead a very difficult life, except for the wealthy ones, because nothing works in Egypt. Food is always short. It's congested. There's sickness, disease. It's a very hard country. So there was this blooming resentment that was going on. And when the people poured out and the spark was lit, the army, after some hesitation, did not intervene. And I believe that the army actually told Mubarak to go.
My name is Danya Nadar, and I am currently living in Cairo. I'm Egyptian, and I grew up in Toronto mainly, but I've been living in Egypt back and forth. So this was kind of a taste of public space, and public space being treated in a way that all of us, socially and economically different, can come together and march and rise up against one person, which was Hosni Mubarak.
What do we know about Islamic Brotherhood as a movement prior to coming into power?
The question of the Islamic Brotherhood, which of course since the time of Nasser had been criminalized at different points, had been its members arrested at different points, had been kept as political outsiders, and had not been able to run as its own party throughout that period. Right? They emerge in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006, running some of their candidates as independents and gaining some political presence that way, even under Mubarak, in terms of its support beyond its membership, which I think is the question. Mm-hmm. Its support amongst the population at large. How does it come to see 51.6% or so of the population voting for it, or at least winning that number in the election? Yes, I think that's right. I think one sees a population for whom the Brotherhood had been providing social services for many decades, often underground, often operating at the margins, often as political outsiders.
After Mubarak was removed from power, for a short period, the Islamic Brotherhood, led by Morsi, ruled Egypt. Tell us what happened then.
Well, there's several aspects, but one in particular, between Hosni Mubarak and Morsi, there was the Military Council of the Supreme Forces. The SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, they were at the forefront politically between Hosni Mubarak and Mohammed Morsi. So there was a year and a half gap before Mohammed Morsi was actually elected.
So the Muslim Brotherhood clearly has and maintains, even in its turn toward civil political parties through the Freedom and Justice Party more recently, clearly continues to call. It is an Islamist party and clearly continues to call for greater Islamic values in law. And so one sees some Islamization within the movement towards the Muslim Brotherhood.
Egypt's wealthy elite and Egypt's media, which was completely controlled by the Mubarak forces, launched this campaign, as I said, the Christians are going to be massacred, and Egypt is going to become another Iran with the mullahs running everything, and the women are going to have to wear the burqa, etc. It's not true, but the Egyptians were panicked. And it's so ironic because the Muslim Brotherhood proved itself quite incompetent. It made many, many mistakes. As I said, it couldn't seize power, and it was stumbling and bumbling while the opposition forces proved quite effective in overthrowing the regime.
This was not an easy moment to govern Egypt. You're taking political power immediately after revolution. Foreign capital is going to be skittish about any place that has recently undergone a revolution, particularly when Western media, academic commentators, political elites signaled the whole thing as part of a widespread Arab Spring. So there was going to be skittishness amongst foreign investors no matter what was going to happen. Morsi was unable, and the Freedom and Justice Party, and with it the Muslim Brotherhood, was unable to reverse that tide. Whether that tide was reversible or not, I think, is an open question. But they were clearly unable to reverse that tide, and they were unable to forge political alliances with the other institutions of the state, such as the judiciary, which they took on directly, and even the military.
Morsi, in his decree or in his capability within the country, he has not been able to, quote-unquote, cleanse or change or reform major institutions within the country. And one of those major institutions is the security apparatus, the Interior Ministry. The Interior Ministry is a very well-funded system, and he has not been able to change it or infiltrate it within the system. So this security apparatus eventually was able to work against him. Same thing with major ministries, same thing with the gas ministry or natural gas ministry. He was not able to get his people or his cronies in, and so they, which have a 60-year embedded institution, also worked against Morsi. There were major power cuts and major shortage of gas before Morsi's downfall.
What was also important, I was in Egypt before the overthrow of Morsi. What happened was that the police were completely invisible. The Mubarakist forces withdrew the police from the streets. So for the first time, there was major street crime in Egypt. People were robbed, were raped. There was social chaos in the streets caused by the withdrawal of the police. And what the military did, or its supporters, is that they caused artificial shortages of bread and cooking oil and sugar and other staples of life. This is what really sparked social unrest.
What role and power does the military have in Egypt?
It is the military, who once again has been ruling for 60 years, etc., who give us elections. This military will not design laws around elections to make it, as an entity or as an institution, go away. It is not in the best interest of the military to leave the political scene. It is able to have more of a covert scene in Egypt. So So you mentioned Morsi won 51%. A few weeks before the final results or the second round of the presidential election, the military or the constitutional court came out with a constitutional decree dissolving parliament and stating that any elected government will not have any legislative or parliamentary powers. So we knew that Morsi, upon walking into his post, or whichever president was going to be elected, whether it was Ahmed Shafiq or Mohamed Morsi, that they would not have any legitimacy, they will not have any powers to function, and that they would always have to ask the hand of the mafia, the military mafia in this country.
And the army has always been its own institution. It's a completely self-centered, self-satisfying institution. So the army is always a danger to the central government. What Morsi should have done was he should have kicked out all the senior officers above the rank of colonel and brought up his own men in the army. Colonels like Colonel Nasser came to power, but he didn't.
This country has continued to see military rule, regardless of whether there's a civilian that's in power for 1 year, has continued to see military rule, and this military rule has special interests. It owns 40% of the Egyptian economy. It has closed budgets. It is untransparent. It does not allow any civilian monitoring of its budgets. This hoarding of the economy and of land in Egypt by the military council provides very little for the rest of the country and for Egyptians at large.
That's correct. Well, really, Egypt has been a military-run regime since the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser.
Yeah.
And but the army in Egypt after the fall of Mubarak had the same problem that the army in Pakistan has had, and that is that where they really want to take complete power, the country's economic and social problems are so complex and difficult, maybe insoluble, that the army said no, because we're going to get blamed for everything if we overtly seize power. So we'll step back a few feet, we'll put in a facade of civilian regime and let them take the blame for everything that goes wrong.
What led to the huge demonstrations against Morsi and the Islamic Brotherhood?
So about 2 months ago, there was a movement called Rebel Movement, Tamarrud, in Egypt. It was a group of guys, a group of young guys, they came together and they said, we are going to have a petition, to petition against Morsi and to have enough votes, let's say, quote unquote votes, to say that we're not happy with Morsi. There's no security in the streets. Prices are getting things are getting more expensive. We still have not seen social justice. The major demands of the revolution still have not been met. Mm-hmm. So this movement really began to expand, and it really began to take charge. Towards the deadline, which was June 30th, which was the day that he was inaugurated last year, suddenly there was a shift in the media. Suddenly there was a shift on who was signing. And suddenly there was a major push. And this push was continued to be instigated by the security apparatus. The Interior Ministry was encouraging. They were getting recruits, military recruits, and some of them end up in the Interior Ministry in Egypt. So they're getting recruits to sign. They're getting lieutenants to sign, and there's pictures of people saying the police and the people and the military are one hand, and the military started coming out and making speeches against Morsi or warning him, and etc.
What is the future of Islamic parties in Egypt?
What one has, because the Muslim Brotherhood has now been ousted from power, one has two dimensions happening that have made it slightly more complicated for the military. The first are massive protests in the streets that we hear a lot less about, of members of the Muslim Brotherhood protesting the ouster of the Freedom and Justice Party and protesting the ouster and arrest of several leading Muslim Brotherhood members. And the language here has changed significantly. The language here is not merely a language for Islamization, is not merely a language even for what's called Ikhwanization, which is the brotherhoodization of the state, but rather the language here has become one of what quote-unquote legitimacy. And a group of Islamist parties led by the Muslim Brotherhood has started a new organization called the National Association for Legitimacy.
But what people don't recognize is that the problem isn't Morsi. as a human or political Islam, because now, although this may actually be the ripple effect of the downfall of political Islam or making sure that the Muslim Brothers go back underground in Egypt and within the region, it is not necessarily a failure of political Islam, because political Islam was never implemented, especially not within the last year.
They have to rebuild it. Their leadership is going to be decapitated, or has been already. It's going to be arrested, thrown in jail. They're going to need new, younger leaders. But in a sense, the Brotherhood has been discredited because they proved themselves helpless once in power. They lacked the ruthlessness and determination to really run Egypt. They tried to do it on democratic principles, and it failed miserably, which is really the terrible story to come out of this coup. My own feeling is they're going to be replaced by more militant extremist people, because the lesson will be drawn. The West is not going to allow any real democratic governments in the Arab world. We've had 3 examples now of really, truly democratically elected governments. Algeria, 1992, where the Islamic Front was overthrown by the army, crushed, arrested, with U.S. and French backing. We have the election in Gaza, where Hamas was elected and was immediately locked up and put away in prison and starved. And now we have Egypt.
I fear that we will go back to more of the same. I fear that over the next short period, there will be lots of blood, because there's lots of blood being called for. Sisi who is not the president, he is the deputy prime minister and the minister of defense. But Adli Mansour, the interim president, has given him leeway to go out and make speeches against a group that was formally elected in landslide elections in the parliament and an elected president. But now they are called terrorists. So suddenly, the Sisi is calling for blood against these people. And the Muslim Brothers have historically been used as pawns, or as fear pawns, to make people say, we don't want them, and eventually they get crushed and they go back underground. So I believe that for the Muslim Brotherhood, they will be blood against the Muslim Brotherhood, and Egyptians will generally be apathetic to this blood. And that the Muslim Brotherhood will go back underground, and they will start working on a grassroots level, as they have historically been doing. I believe that there will be, after the Muslim Brotherhood, who are called terrorists, will be shoved aside, then us, people who are against the system, or who are against the security state and against the military, will also be encompassed as terrorists. And we will also be sought out.
The question is for Egyptians, what is next?
Egypt is back in the Mubarak era. I'm wondering how soon it'll be before they let Mubarak out of prison and make him president again. He won't. But what the Egyptians will do, what the Egyptian army is joined at the hip with the U.S. Pentagon. It gets all its money, all of its weapons, all of its spare parts and ammunition and intelligence from the U.S. The Egyptian army has become almost an extension of the U.S. military forces. What's going to happen is the army officers know perfectly well that the U.S. wants the appearance of a democratic government in Egypt. Not the actuality, because that was the Morsi government, but they want the appearance. So a civilian government, probably led by Mohammed al-Baradei, who's known widely in Egypt as Washington's man, will probably be put into place.
The reason why al-Baradei is in this interim government, or in this interim cabinet, is because the rebel movement, Tamarrud, they nominated him. They said, we want al-Baradei to be a part of creating the roadmap towards a better future of Egypt. And so this was like the military's acceptance of the Tamarrud's demands. And so his role right now is pushing and encouraging people to lobby him, encouraging people who've been doing work for a decade to come to him and propose to him, and so that they can actually start mapping something out.
What's your last word?
I used to live once in Egypt, and I'm very fond of Egypt, and I feel great sorrow for this country because its economy is crashing. Even American and Saudi aid may not solve the problem. Tourism has vanished. The Egyptian people are suffering, and there's over 80 million people living in the fertile land the size of Maryland. It's a very difficult situation. And things, I think, are going to only get worse for Egypt. For years, I've been predicting an uprising against Mubarak, an explosion of discontent and suffering in Egypt. We're going to see it again, this time directed probably against the army.
In some sense, there's this push to try and eradicate as history and in terms of memory of Egyptians and their experience during Mubarak, and also especially their experience since Mubarak's deposement, which the military has done in the past. In 1952, after the British were kicked out of Egypt, there was a president called Mohammed Naguib. And then after 2 years, within those 2 years of when he was around, he was pushing for democracy, and he was pushing for handing over the government or handing over legitimacy to a civilian-led government and to a civilian-led president. But the Security Council, which was led by Abdel Nasser at the time, did not like that, and they did not want that at all, so they quieted him. He was under house arrest until he died in the late 80s. And anybody who was around him, who was pushing, they were called Zubat al-Ahrar, the Free Officers Movement. They were also quieted, the people who were surrounding Mohammed Naguib. People completely forgot about that era, and there's very little that is written about that time between 1952 and 1954. That people say the first Egyptian president of Egypt was Abdel Nasser, which is not true. The first Egyptian president of Egypt is Mohammed Naguib, but he's been erased from Egyptian history books and erased in even the global domain. I fear that this exact thing will happen again. But finally, I think the most important lesson that's being taken away from what happened on June 30th is that people believe, whether or not, to which degree it is entirely pure or not, it doesn't matter. People believe that they have the power to depose a president. That Egyptians believe that if they go out in the millions into the streets, that they now have a voice. And this is probably the most critical aspect of what will lead us into the future, is that although, yes, the first year and a half was military council over rule of Egypt, in the beginning, in March 2011, nobody would stay down with the military regime. But by November 2011, there were hordes of people in the streets staying down with the military regime, and I believe that it'll happen again. But there needs to be a downtime. People are tired, and people are sad, and people are scared.
This conversation with Ron Levy, Eric Margolis, and Danya Nadar was recorded on August 2013. I'm Souad Sharabani.